At the end of the Burning Crusade, Paladins were pretty much the same class they were in vanilla, albeit with the ability to tank and a few quality of life improvements. In Wrath of the Lich King, however, Paladins changed so much they were almost a completely different class. This was a much needed change, but a lot of different things went into it. I'll break it down and explain what these changes were. Now, if you remember from my vanilla video, I said that one of the things I'd look at in the Paladin class was the Seal and Judgment system. I hardly mentioned it at all in the Burning Crusade, but that's because it hardly changed at all. In Wrath of the Lich King, it did change. Up until Wrath of the Lich King, seals only lasted 30 seconds, Judgment consumed them, and then turned them into a debuff on the enemy depending on which seal was consumed. Pretty much if you want a particular debuff, you had to cast that particular seal. And then you had to recast another seal after you cast Judgment because now you've consumed the buff on yourself. Wrath of the Lich King changed all of that. Seals were not consumed when you cast Judgment, and now there were 3 different Judgment spells, each with their own debuff. All 3 of them dealt damage depending on which seal you had active. Plus, seals went from lasting 30 seconds to 2 minutes and then 30 minutes. Wow. So now you can have whichever seal you want active on yourself, and you can have whichever debuff you want active on the enemy. This system was much more flexible and much more fun. Also, remember what I said in the Burning Crusade video about seals having redundant effects? Blizzard took notice of this and changed Seal of Command so that it had a kind of a cleave-like effect. They did this towards the middle of the expansion, and this is just one of many examples showing that Blizzard was not afraid to make changes mid-expansion at this point. Now, if you were paying attention in the Vanilla and Burning Crusade videos, you'll think, wait a minute, what happened to Judgment of the Crusader? Well, Blizzard decided to do something about spellbar bloat, and they got rid of Seal of the Crusader and Judgment of the Crusader. They merged the plus holy damage buff into all of our damage abilities. The same thing happened to Sanctity Aura. Its plus 10% holy damage buff was merged into all of our holy damage spells as well. In the same vein, Blessing of Light is gone. For those of you who don't recall, it specifically buffed Holy Light and Flash of Light. Its effect also got merged into those spells. This was the first of our blessings to die. These were nice quality of life improvements since you no longer needed to do quite as much to set yourself up to be as powerful as possible. Also, the fact that our heals were gimped without casting Blessing of Light meant that we couldn't cast other, more interesting buffs on the tank such as Kings or Might. So it was a quality of life improvement for people we were grouped with as well. This wasn't the only change to our blessings. One thing which was true then and is still true today is that per paladin there can only be 1 blessing on a target at a time. That doesn't make much sense now because buffs have been standardized and other classes can bring more than 1 buff to the table. Why can't paladins? But this 1 blessing per paladin per target thing made a lot of sense then. Those blessings were powerful at first. However, one thing didn't make sense from back then. There were 2 types of blessings, short-term ones and long-term ones. And since there's only 1 blessing per paladin per target, casting a short-term blessing will overwrite the long-term blessing. That was kind of annoying, so Blizzard decided to change the short-term blessings into hand spells. Again, there can only be 1 hand per target per paladin, but at least they no longer overwrite the long-term blessings. Part and parcel of this change was that Blessing of Salvation became Hand of Salvation. Blessing of Salvation was perhaps Paladin's most important blessing. In vanilla, there was a real chance that enemies would suddenly ignore the tank and charge at your casters. Threat management was a real issue back then. In fact, there were talents specifically made to lower the threat that your spells caused. In that environment, those talents were important, and Blessing of Salvation helped a lot. In fact, groups were pretty gimped without Blessing of Salvation. In some cases, players had to deliberately lower their DPS in order to avoid drawing aggro off the tank. That did contribute to the figure-it-out-yourself vibe, but let's face it, it wasn't fun. Blizzard's response to this was to lower everyone's threat by 30% automatically as if they already had Blessing of Salvation active. Then they removed Blessing of Salvation from the Paladin's kit, and in its place gave Paladins a brief hand spell that was basically an anti-taunt. I loved the idea, but rarely used it in practice. I've used it a few times in Mist, but not very often. Now, take a look at how many blessings we had before Wrath of the Lich King, and take a look at how many blessings we had afterwards. Far fewer. In fact, if you didn't spec for them, you didn't have Kings or Sanctuary either. So baseline, it was just Might and Wisdom. Again, this is actually a good thing, seeing as how paladins are no longer buff bots like they were in vanilla. They've got other and better things to do. In Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard finally got serious about making it fun to play a paladin. For context, Protection in the Burning Crusade was an effective tanking spec, but they mostly dealt passive damage. They only had Judgment and Avenger's Shield for on-demand damage, and Consecration, well, it was effective, but it dealt damage so slowly it almost doesn't count in terms of what buttons you click. Then, in Wrath of the Lich King, they added Hammer of the Righteous. Again, it was very deep in the tree. I still don't know whether Blizzard was adding cool stuff that deep, because they wanted to keep it spec-specific to keep paladins from getting overpowered, or whether they needed cool stuff deep in the trees, or both. But with a short cooldown, this new ability meant that Protection was actively clicking buttons in order to tank. And this wasn't the only new ability Protection got. They also got Shield of Righteousness. This was the first strike-like new ability that was baseline. It helped Protection, but it also helped Holy, and it made soloing as Holy much more fun. Also, Holy Shock's cooldown was lowered to 6 seconds. Having soloed and leveled as Holy back then, I can tell you it was suddenly a lot more fun to play as Holy. I was almost constantly clicking buttons. And on top of that, Holy Shock as a heal was also buffed. The Infusion of Light passive was added to make Holy Shock worthwhile during PvE healing. Remember how in the Burning Crusade nothing changed for healing? In Wrath of the Lich King, things changed. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, stuff like Word of Glory, Light of Dawn, Holy Radiance, that stuff got added, right? Wrong. Holy didn't exactly get any new heal spells, but to say that they got nothing in Wrath of the Lich King would be a lie. Sacred Shield was introduced, and that boosted Flash of Light's crit chance as well as absorbing some damage. And while there still weren't any group heals per se, we did get Beacon of Light, and that helped a lot. I remember an incident in vanilla where a warlock kept pulling aggro off the tank. Every time that happened I couldn't heal her because I was focused on healing the tank. And again, in vanilla, paladins had no group heals. After this happened a few times I yelled at her, "Yikes, watch your aggro." Her answer was, "Yikes, Long Rider, heal me." In vanilla, I could not do that. In Wrath of the Lich King, I could. Wrath of the Lich King is also where Divine Plea was added. Before Wrath of the Lich King, the cooldown on potions started as soon as you drank the potion, not as soon as the fight ended. In most of the longer fights, you could expect to use up stack after stack of potions to keep your mana up. But in Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard changed the potion philosophy so that you could only use one potion per fight. That change hit Paladins hard since we didn't have any active way of restoring our mana in our kits. Hunters at the time had Aspect of the Viper, Warlocks had Life Tap, Mages had Invocation, and Shaman had Mana Tide Totem. Paladins had nothing, so Blizzard had to add a mana replenishing tool, and add one they did. Divine Plea became available at level 71, and it was on a 1-minute cooldown that restored 25% of the Paladin's mana pool. The drawback to having it active was that your heals were less effective while it was going, so you had to decide strategically when you were going to cast it. It's worth adding that Divine Plea was a trainable ability, which meant that Protection and Retribution had it too, and in fact both specs were set up with Divine Plea mana restoration in mind. The passives that replenish mana today for those specs weren't in place in Wrath of the Lich King. At this point you're probably all asking, okay, how did Retribution change? Well, they changed a lot. And not just at the beginning of Wrath of the Lich King when they introduced new talents and abilities, they also got a lot of changes during the expansion too. For starters, they got Divine Storm, so now they had lots of buttons to click and their rotation was pretty much first come first serve, and they're better at doing AoE DPS. But I think the biggest shift was the fact that Blizzard was serious about making Retribution a viable PvE DPS spec. I'm probably not making much sense to you, so for context, before Wrath of the Lich King, you spec'd Retribution if and only if you wanted to PvP. Back then, there were some specs which you only went into if you wanted to play player versus player. Blizzard did away with that design philosophy in Wrath of the Lich King, and this is illustrated well by the fact that Blizzard gave a minus threat talent to Retribution, and believe me, they needed it. They were often juggling threat with the tank without it. So Retribution had a lot of improvements, but there was still one fly in the ointment for them. They had nothing ranged. They had no tools for pulling enemies, and that could make for some very sucky soloing moments. That problem did not last forever, though. A little ways into Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard changed their taunt philosophy because of encounter design. Some of the encounters required you to taunt one boss off of another tank, But that was tough when you didn't have a taunt that actually targets enemies. So Blizzard gave Paladins Hand of Reckoning, and while they were at it they made Warriors taunt so that it was ranged. But keep in mind, Hand of Reckoning was available at an early level and it was baseline. That meant Retribution got the very pulling tool that they needed. This was a great quality of life improvement for Retribution. However, this quality of life improvement displays a disturbing trend that has continued until today. Blizzard generally won't make quality of life improvements without an ulterior motive. Even so, at the time, I thought things couldn't get any better for Paladins, but then they did get better. Retribution's push into PvE DPS territory made for quality of life improvements for Holy, not just in Wrath of the Lich King, but also in Cataclysm. Remember how Exorcism could only target the undead? Essentially that made it a DPS spell in Wrath of the Lich King's first tier, since the first raid was Naxxramas, and that was full of the undead. When Blizzard released the next tier, which was a Titan raid called Ulduar, and as such didn't contain any undead, they noticed Retribution's DPS went way down. They did not want that to happen, so they bit the bullet and made Exorcism, which was trainable at the time, so that it could hit anything, not just demons or undead. They made sure that Exorcism kept a little anti-undead flavor by saying that anytime you cast Exorcism on something that was undead or a demon, it was guaranteed to crit. Even so, the fact that Exorcism could be cast on anything now was the beginning of the end of Paladin's specifically anti-undead flavor. It's worth adding that part and parcel with that change, Exorcism went from being instant cast to timed cast because Blizzard did not want Retribution to use that spell while they were closing in on targets. That doesn't make sense to players today because Retribution has a lot of ranged tools nowadays, and that doesn't make them overpowered in Mists of Pandaria's PvP environment. But in Wrath of the Lich King's PvP environment, it was overpowering. I haven't been talking about PvP in this series because I was never really into PvP and I don't feel like I'd have a good perspective on it. But I can say that during Wrath of the Lich King, PvP was all about burst damage. And with multiple on-demand damage abilities, Ret had burst damage. The only thing that kept Retribution from being completely overpowered was the fact that they could only do this burst damage if they got close. So Blizzard gave Exorcism a cast timer, and then they added the Art of War proc, so that Retribution Paladins would be able to use Exorcism once they were in melee. That also made the spec more interesting because you never quite knew when you'd get that proc. Plus, if you really wanted to, you could spend the proc on healing. You can tell, Blizzard was not shy about changing Paladins mid-expansion in those days. They've become more shy about making those kinds of changes since then, sad to say. There is one change that we wanted and did not get. Blizzard was painfully reluctant to drop Blessing of Kings down to a trainable ability. At first, they tried to make it a Tier 1 5-point talent before they did. I'm serious, it was a freaking buff, and they didn't like the idea of dropping it down. Finally, they caved. Now let's take a look back at what Paladins were. In Vanilla, they were a boring class crammed into the support role. In the Burning Crusade, they were viable and effective tanks. In the Wrath of the Lich King, they became versatile, fun, and effective in all three roles. Paladins had really turned a corner in this expansion. It was while Wrath of the Lich King was in development that I did the Does Blizzard Really Hate Paladins series. I'm sure you can see why I thought I had to make that series. Paladins had been boring buff bots at the time, and the only acknowledgement Blizzard ever gave us that those problems even existed was the occasional joke, making it look like they were sadistically having fun at their customers' expense. A lot of people have said to me that it was because of that series that Paladins turned this corner, but since none of the people were working at Blizzard, I don't know if it's true or not. Blizzard may have been planning to make these improvements all along. Yikes, I really cannot make a short video, can I? I think I'm going to have to break off a separate part to talk about professions in engineering. Before I close out this video, I have a small retraction to make. Upper Blackrock Spire was a 15-man raid, not a 10-man. Sorry about that. I strive for accuracy.